But here's what throws their whole theory off. Paul wrote Romans after that was discussed in Acts. The book of Acts was written before Paul's Romans, okay? Abraham offering Isaac was not a work. It was by faith he offered them, and if it was of a work, it was a debt, and God's a debtor to no man. And men and brethren, why do we put a yoke, the law, around men's necks that neither we or our fathers could bear it? We should be living like the Gentiles by faith.
You know, one of the things that you see throughout Scripture, especially in the old Scriptures and in the Old Covenant, it all related to things, you know, God demanding circumcision because it was a sign that the flesh, the nature of man, the fleshly nature of man being cut off and no longer being the influence in a person's life that would drive them, motivate them, and do those things, but that God would be the one that would dominate their lives and influence their lives through the law, through the teachings of the law, and that they would walk in that. And you know, what I look at through Scripture is that, you know, that's the big controversy, because it's God comes, the Lord comes, and one of the things that He does is that He establishes a way by which a different type of circumcision can take place within a person's life, not a physical one like they did in the old covenant, but one that was under a new covenant, which was the circumcision of a person's heart. That circumcision.
That's so good, Brother Bill. That's exactly it. And in fact, if you look at chapter 21 of the book of Acts, Paul was actually put in jail because Timothy went into a place where he was not circumcised. Remember in Galatians where they say they came in, they crept in unaware, spying out our liberty? What they were actually doing, and this is why I'm not a legalist. If there's any reason not to be a legalist, I'm not going to go in a urinal and try to see if someone's circumcised, okay? So I'm for that reason alone. But that's what they did. And that's how they knew that he wasn't circumcised. And they accused Paul of breaking the law by letting a Gentile. Well, Paul knew that circumcision, and he later wrote, and let me just bring this out because it's real powerful. It was James that approached Paul and says, listen, it's said among us that you're teaching that our children does not have to keep the law of Moses, nor do they need to be circumcised. And Paul apparently, and this is where the legalists go to, okay? They'll quote that scripture and they'll say, there it is. Paul went and shaved his head. He said, here's what he said. James says, so they will know that you keep the law. Go do this. Now, he was warned of Agabus by the Spirit of God. He was warned not to go, but he said, I'm not only willing to go, but I'm willing to die. And sure enough, that would be the end of Paul as we know it publicly until his death, okay? And so what he said there was, here's the accusation. You're teaching our children not to keep the law of Moses. You're teaching them not to be circumcised. The Jewish people now. He wasn't even worried about now it's getting to the Jews he's saying it. Okay? And then, so that they will know you keep the law of Moses, go do this, and he went and did it. Now, here's the kicker, Pastor Bill. I understand this by the volume of the study that I've done scripturally, and you look at the whole context. At first, Paul went to, in chapter 2 of Galatians, to the pillars of the church, so he wouldn't be a castaway. He didn't even know what he was teaching because it was so foreign to what he learned under the law. So he was still kind of submitting, and here's what he said in Galatians 2. They didn't add nothing to me. And then they wanted to put some laws on him about taking care of the poor and strangling meat. And he said, I was going to do that anyway, so it wasn't an issue. But what he's saying in chapter 21 leads a person, if they're reading it, to say, well, yeah, Paul kowtowed to James and went and did it. But here's what throws their whole theory off. Paul wrote Romans after that was discussed in Acts. The book of Acts was written before Paul's Romans, okay? Paul then, after he now gets caught up in heaven, he said, I knew a man, whether in the spirit or not, I don't know. We know it was Paul.
Right.
He was caught in the third heaven. He saw things that was unbelievable. Well, this is where I believe God tutored him into the real aspect of the law. Once he had that experience, he came back and wrote the book of Romans, totally went against James chapter 2. Look, you're not saved by faith alone, James says, but by works also. Paul comes back in Romans 4, where the circumcision is, but he starts off and saying, wait, Abraham offering Isaac was not a work. It was by faith he offered them, and if it was of a work, it was a debt, and God's a debtor to no man. And he said, furthermore, circumcision does not profit a Jew or a Gentile. Now he's boldly refuting what he was thinking, well, maybe these guys know and maybe I don't know, okay?
You know, you bring up a point in that scripture that it talks about God's not a debtor to any man. What, in your understanding of that scripture, I know I have an understanding of it as well, but for those that are watching right now, those that are tuned in, you know, they may be asking, how does God become a debtor to man? Yeah. If that is what Paul is referring to, that he's not a debtor to any man. And I think, you know, Pastor, could you expound on that?
Well, of course. It's very clear that when James wrote, these were disciples that every day of their life they were taught to cross every T and every dot of the law.
Right.
Jesus had to fulfill the law perfectly. Yeah. And his disciples, imagine, I mean, it's almost as bad as this. Now, this may be a way out analogy, but it drives a point home. Okay? What would happen if I teach against fornication, okay, and then one day I step in the pulpit and say, hey, it's okay to fornicate? You'd have people fleeing out of the church, and they should.
Right,
okay?
They should, because that's
But that's about as drastic as moving from being trained under the law and keeping every ceremony, and then all of a sudden saying, you don't have to do it, okay?
Right.
And so the disciples were a little bit further coming along, making this transition. Peter made it, and he made it in Acts 10, and we'll talk about that later.
Right.
But what happened was they couldn't make the transition right away. That's why in Galatians 2, when Peter saw James' disciples coming, he knew what James believed in. And he believed that the Gentiles, if they were uncircumcised, you shouldn't eat with them because they were unclean.
Yeah.
And Paul saw Peter's hypocrisy. He would eat with them because he knew that circumcision didn't make him saved or not. Peter knew.
Right.
Okay? But by withdrawing himself and kowtailing to the disciples of James, here's what Paul observed. He said, why do you teach the Gentiles to live like the Jews, or the Gentiles that live like the Jews? Why, we're not teaching the Jews to live like the Gentiles, okay? That was his argument. And here was Paul's argument. He said, Peter, you're not teaching the truth of the gospel.
Right.
You're not teaching the truth.
Right.
The truth is circumcision doesn't matter at all. The law has no relativity to the new birth. This is, watch, I'll give you one more, Acts 15. And I know you're itching to get in here, and I want you to get in.
No, I'm fine.
So watch this, Acts 15. And they accused Paul, okay, of not circumcising the Gentile. So Paul said, where are you getting this from? They said, from Jerusalem, from the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John.
Right.
Okay? So it's only Peter and James named in Acts 15. But when they go back there, here are born-again Pharisees like Paul was. Paul was a born-again Pharisee. These were born-again Pharisees, and they didn't know. It proves it. They were arguing, should they be circumcised? Should they not be? Now, this is how you know Peter got it. Peter stood up and said, men and brethren, why do we put a yoke, the law, around men's necks that neither we or our fathers could bear it?
Right.
We should be living like the Gentiles by faith. You know what James did? Oh, wait a minute. Moses is preached on a Sabbath. We can't just forget about him. So he imposed 3 laws. No strangled meat eaten with blood, strangled, and the blood remaining in the meat. No eating the idols, and no fornication. Paul said, write the letter. I'm all for that. I don't want to fornicate. I don't want to eat meat off of the idol. But you know, Paul had to come back and correct it later because he took it from a different perspective. I'll only take one and then I'm through. Okay? But they're all three there. He refutes the fact that we need to keep all three of them. Okay? The first one, that's clear. Does Paul teach that a believer can eat meat offered to idols? Well, he does.
Yeah.
Okay, he does, but he qualifies it.
Yeah.
If they put the meat before you and they say, this is offered to idols, this is offered to idols, to see if you will partake of it within their mind thinking you're partaking of the table of devils,
right,
then don't eat it. But he said, if you can get it at 50% off at the shambles, go buy it and eat it.
It's a popular teaching that if you gave X amount of dollars, then God owed you. And if you gave this, then God owed you a car.
Or God would heal you if you send a $1,000 offering in.
Well, that's more today than ever because that's their hustle.
And
it's a shame.
And Jesus said, here is the work, that you believe on the one that the Father sent.
Wow.
You see?
Believe.
His
yoke is easy because it's simply to believe. And that belief, what makes it so easy is the fact that he's already given us the measure of faith to believe it.